Authoritarianism is the displacement of ideology, which means it's no longer in a trivium, but a consequentialist scheme to abolish the trivium. So, to get authoritarianism, not only must school be part of a coordinated scheme for learning, you must expand upon school to exercise power. So through power, not only does diagrams get manifested through the idiosyncrasies of Congress, the idea that Senate still has a worm in the relationship to schooling and the ability to fire people through power is a congregation of housing. So that means housing is a declarative act here. Housing is a recycling of the lower class to have a greater class conquer it. So not only does the upper class get protected here, it is actually the ability to have that school in the first place. The upper class would be how school manifests, which means is a free tile for free parking, which also means that free parking is a misnomer of how congregation is displaced. Not only is there Congress here for writing the bills, congregation must be met with the ability to have ordered speech laws, which means not only does the church involve itself in the school industry, it has the ability to separate itself at all levels. So not only does the church have privacy and privation here, the private schooling industry is the entrance exam into what we call powered learning. So empowerment learning would be how engineer society runs. Engineers would be a displacement of the money system that orders them around to do material objective training. So to become a banker here is the essence of what they're after, because they're after the ability to banknote on the ability to press. So to have press is the ability of this function, but the banknote system would be how each part of the leveling system would be a varsity of how the upper and middle class denote the return rates for proletariat seizure. Not only does the lower class here have no banknotes, they have no ability to form speech laws for the engineering class, which means they have the right to authoritarianism, while the middle class has no right to seize libertarian assets. This is done through the operative lens of violence. So since violence is a coordination theory, the coordinate grid is always in displacement of who gets to have the most righteous speech. And since seizing assets is always a infungible utility, it is actually part of how the coordinate grid inflexes upon all levels of the center and begins to displace the coordination of guarding. So this garden of utopias is actually how a utopian grid would be made. Because the utopian grid would require people in the lower class to have banknotes, not only does the gardens have the ability to display several of its own applications. These applications would be unitary in notion, and is also how indexes are formed. So indexes are the maintaining of the speech laws, so that both parties, the upper class and the middle class, have something to focus on while working. So since the lower class doesn't make the money, they're the ones that receive paychecks for it. They are actually part of a system of science. So sciences here would be how military and uh, politics are canon. So the canon of military politics would also be how the coordinate grid seizes utopias back into the coordination of the coordinate grid. So not only does this paradox of multiplexes occur, there is a seizing of a right that denies people the Congress of the housing agreement that they had turned under. So since Congress, House, and Senate all agree upon having licenses, a license would be required for the lower class. So since the lower class is always lower class, which means they do not get anything but licenses, this would be how schooling is a manifesto. So manifestos are the only thing a lower class school can produce because they're Third Reich. This Third Reich politics is a abolition of the state, but is also a purity testing of former generations, which means we get to decide how history is written eventually. So this is done through licensing through the middle class. Since the middle class seizes our assets, not only do they have the ability to deny people speech rights, they have the ability to deny people the right to fungibles, which means they do not get books and maintain dollars. So if these college certificates that the lower class have are somehow usable, they are actually used for denying people the vote, which means that's all they do. They do not have voter rights like the upper class, which means they're private, and they do not have the middle class engineering program, which is public. They are independent, which means they're abolished. So this is also how the ability to think about rights exists. Rights are required to have several internments at the same time, which means they have rights on righteous speech and progress on formal speech, which means formal and righteous speech are opposites. This also means that they have the ability to denote who gets cartel work for all three of those classes. So cartel work would be actually how normal people are required to work together. And this is how schools manifest parliaments rather than parties, by having the free market displaced from supply and demand their central point of unity, which means they have walls around them that displace the ceilings of the market. So if a market ceiling is capped here, not only does the right to bear witness happen, it happens on the place that school exists rather than Congress. And Congress is losing the House vote over this because they have no right to have armies that seize capitularies of graphs, which means that trademark Linuxes are traded off at a lesser rate for historical samples of a party that no longer exists.